budget.
You want to present, Mr.
Yes, I
Party?
do.
Thank you. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. Good evening.
Good evening.
Back on April 28th, the board conducted a very brief, of about a 1 hour. First of all, can you hear me through the mask okay? All right. The board conducted a brief preliminary budget workshop, similar to what we're going to do tonight, to see where we were at in the budget process. At that meeting, we all confirmed that we knew the year was going to be starting out so far with expenditures exceeding revenues, and we had work to do. One directive from that meeting was for Finance Department to review the fund balance policy to see whether or not fund balance could help this budget out. Then, at the last meeting, which was May 19th, the board also asked me to present the possible budget reduction scenarios. That is,
Is it somewhere up there?
Molly, could you mute your microphone, please?
Molly, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. My microphone wasn't muted. I believe.
so at the last regular meeting, May 19th, I think it was, the board asked me to come back also with the possible reductions in the budget based on what if we had lost 5, 10, 15, 20% of next year's budget. So tonight, I have two
Somebody's dog.
Okay, that is me. It's my audio, not my phone. Just a second, let me try to remedy that.
Okay, so tonight we have I have two separate budget presentations. The first one is the one that I prepared several weeks ago that is just talking about the budget. It's a continuation of the April 28th meeting. And then the second one is going to discuss the what-if scenario if the budget gets cut 5, 10, 15, 20%. So let's start there. I'm going to take over. Well, come back. Present now. Present now. I should be taking over the screen. It's this one. Let's see.
You click share, Mr. Party.
Share. Okay.
Are we just adding on, because we've never really discussed the first presentation collectively.
This is the one that we didn't discuss, that I
We
mailed
haven't-
out.
Not the initial one, we haven't discussed the initial one either. Because that's what this meeting was for, because we were presented that information.
That's the first presentation.
It's the first presentation.
Right,
and
you're right.
So are we gonna discuss that first?
Yes.
Or are we going
yes.
to
Nope,
move
we're going to
through?
the first one first that says
Okay.
part 2, because part 1 we actually did discuss on April 28th. That was when I presented that we were $1.9 million out of balance. So since then, I've had some renovations, and we'll talk about that. Did you fix me? Okay. Well, this. So I got to make sure I know how to make it go forward.
You can
Just click it.
click present if you want to go to present.
I think, Madam Chair, what's gonna happen is that if we discuss part 1, we're gonna discuss part 1 again when we go to part 2, because part 2 updates part
Well,
1.
this is the wrong one anyways. This is the wrong presentation. My
Part
bad.
2 updates, part 1, is that what you said?
That's
Mr.
correct.
Kennedy?
So when I go back to
Basically,
part
because
2.
there's additional information and things that have happened, so let Anne Marie go through it and you'll see.
Okay, part 2 is part 1 of tonight, but part 2 is part 2 of the budget presentation because we did the first part in April. So bear with me. So the purpose of this particular portion of the program is to discuss the programs of the budget based on the revenue sources. I think it's important that we understand the revenue sources. Discuss the impact of the use of fund balance, which is going to be really key to all of this. Consider the long term, and then note any other discussion or priorities by the board. So fund balance, there's 2 portions, the state requirements and Hendry County policy. State requirements, I'm not going to make you read this. You know what it is, but it's basically, we all knew that the statutes require a 3% general funds revenue reserve, whereas the district has a 6%. Y'all knew that, but for me, I like to prove it by giving you the policy numbers as appropriate. Problem with use the fund balance is that it's a one-time shot. I will always recommend to you to never use a one-time revenue for ongoing expenditures because it's not recurring. We recommend the use of fund balance for capital or non-recurring expenses or an unusual emergency.
Okay.
Let me make sure there's nothing here. So, here's the kicker though, about fund balance. This is the one snag, the snafu, that I encountered when I started doing this analysis, and that is the policy is based on general fund revenue. That is, how much revenue would you 3% or 6% of revenue? The revenue for FY, it's hard to breathe in this. The revenue for FY 2021 is increasing by $9 million. What does that mean? That's an increase that you have to have in your general fund reserves just to cover that. That is the unintended consequences. And as we discussed, the revenue is increasing by $9 million because of the K-12. K-12 added about, well, for now, it added 1,600 kids times the number of FTEs.
Is it possible, and this, I want to direct this question to Molly, our counselor on this, to rewrite a policy that would exclude the, the policy that we have that requires the 6% of the fund balance for our revenues, to specifically, in the wording, specifically exclude the K-12 revenues. So what our fund balance, that percentage is based on, is the revenues that we are keeping in-house and not the ones we're shipping off to K-12.
I can jump in on this one because I think my biggest concern is that the 3% by Florida statute has to be total revenues, which would not be allowed us to exclude. The 6% that we have, that would be, that's a local policy. So she would be able to do that.
But Madam Chair, that's the exact same argument that we used when we were afraid that sparsity was going to be impacted, because we had that jump in enrollment and revenue. And that's why I went to the state and said, yes, that's what the rule says, but that's not reflective of what's happening in Hendry County. So that's why we did not get hit with that. But the rule reads that way. So yeah, I think we probably need to address that issue at a state level also, because that's not our money. I mean, 5% of it is, so if we want to take 6% of that 5%, that's one thing, but take 6% of the total that we're holding back and then we're sending it off is a different picture for the board to have to deal with. You understand what I'm saying?
Absolutely,
Yeah.
and it makes sense.
Yeah.
And that is basically what you would be doing, is instead of doing it as a revenue and expense, it would be a revenue and a contra revenue, because this isn't really our revenue, we're taking it right back out. I just don't think on an accounting rise, I don't think that that's gonna be allowable, but it's something we can explore. I like exploring that. So, as you can see about fund balance, let's.
I was just gonna jump in and say, yes, to, the superintendent for answering that. I agree with what you said, and just from a legal perspective, all I would say is kind of the same thing, that as long as we're keeping with the 3% of the statute, that you could amend your policy as long as it's in keeping, so it's at least the floor that's required by the statute. That's all, thank you.
Yeah, and then what I would make darn sure that the auditor knew that, so that they'd come through, and then don't say how come you're falling below your 3% threshold, so that everybody needs to know what we're doing, or if the board, what you'll be doing if the board chooses to do that.
So this particular form right here tells you what happened because we went from $57.8 million in budgeted revenue to $66 million. Our 6% requirement, which is where we're at right now, the $3.48 million, increases to $4.01 million. So just to continue to achieve the 6%, we have to have an additional reserve of almost $543,000. That was the unintended consequence of taking on the K-12. Now, is that a bad thing? No, it's not a bad thing, but it's more than I think it's more than we're practically making off of K-12. So it becomes an issue. And the other thing is, remember, that's only based on 1,600 students. As of now, I believe they've got over 2,000 students. So eventually the FTEs will be reflected on that. So this particular report, again, starts telling you that if you wanted to retain the current fund balance, the current reserve requirement for 2021 based on the $66 million, if you just dropped it from 6% to 5%, you wouldn't really have that significant of a change in your, in the reserve. See how I've got those two highlighted just to show that they're kind of similar? That wasn't what you were asking for out of all this, I know that. What you were asking for was if we reduced the fund balance, how much more money would we have for that year? If you went from the 6% to the 3%, you'd have $1.7 million more. As a reminder, at the time that we discussed this, my balance was $1.9 million out of balance. So this isn't the cure-all, but don't give up yet. It's not a game changer. It's not, everything's not over yet, because at the end of this fiscal year, we still expect for us to have $8.2 million in total fund balance. Of that, $145,000 is going to be unexpendable. Trying to get some oxygen here. By unexpendable, we mean that it's a fixed asset, it's not an asset, it's inventories or something other things that can't be spent. Usually it's an inventory. Of that, some of it will be restricted. That's just a wild guess on my part. Restricted generally would be the categoricals that the state requires us to spend. If we didn't spend it this year, we have to spend next year. But we still have that committed and the unassigned, which we were just talking about, but you still have that 4.1 million left over. So if that's the case, then 632.20, you can actually make it if you have to spend, wait for it, how much? So let's go to, this is what would happen at the end of this year. At the end of this year, we'd have $8.2 million at the end of this current year. We used the $2.4 million to balance, which, as I told you, is going to be, it went from 1.9 to 2.4 because of me. We can use the committed fund balance, keep our unassigned at the full 6%, and you're still going to have $5.2 million at the end of the fiscal year. So that's at the end of next fiscal year. You actually survive. See how it says survivable for the budget year? However, not if the trend continues.
But this is, when we're talking about being survivable for next year, this is if
You are correct.
we don't get any line item vetoes, which is not gonna happen because after the election, it's gonna get real. So, but that's what you're saying, that
Right,
it's
this is-
survivable pending no cuts
This
from
is our
legislature.
perfect world scenario at the current, with the current revenue projections and the current expenditure projections. So let's assume that we continue, that the world gets back to our norm. Remember I told you on the prior page, let me see if I can't go back. Nope, uh-oh.
No, it's a mistake.
Hold on, I gotta figure out how to go, oh, wait, I found it.
Yep.
I found it, I went back too far. So remember right here, I told you that the survivable for the current budget year, we would end at $5.2 million. Then what? Then, the fiscal year that ends, I think it goes 21-22, you start with that same 5.2 million that we ended with. But if we have to use 2.4 million and then some, which is why I've got 3 million to balance the following fiscal year, you don't have enough money. So that was my whole point of this. I know that it's kind of a long drawn out, but this is my whole point, is that this particular spending pattern is unsustainable. It's sustainable for one more year, but it's not a sustainable pattern.
Look at the year, 2022, look at the year.
What?
It's a big year for 3 board members, 2022.
Oh, okay. So, now, I'm gonna jump ship because that is my waving the flag, holy cow, this is not a sustainable pattern.
Okay.
So let's talk a little bit about revenues and expenditures, which is obviously still a work in progress. In fact, today I met with Dr. Staley, and in reviewing her budget, she says, oh, did I not tell you we canceled that contract? So she cut her budget by about, bear with me, I think it was $140,000. So the numbers that I'm bringing you right now are $140,000 too high.
Okay.
There was a contract that is not included in all this, but you had already cut, is it? Neo, begins with an N, Navaline?
No, it was Navient.
Navient, so that one was gone.
Navient should
I had
not-
had,
That's done. That's
right,
over.
I had had that in my budget for original
We paid
numbers. and
that
this
one
is-
out.
Right, he already
last
said
year.
that, but my numbers showed that originally. So some of these numbers, as I'm putting them out there and discussing them with the directors or the principals or whatever, they're saying, where'd you come up with that? Oh, sorry. So again, we're fixing things as we go.
I do have a question. So toward the beginning here, it says, you say, about the fund balance, our policy is based on the general fund revenue, up for the fiscal year 2021, we're increasing by $9 million over 1920. The slide previous to this one, you're telling me it's still a work in progress. I'm kind of curious how you came up with 9 million here, but you're telling me we're still a work in progress.
Revenues are pretty confident because they are directed to me from the state of Florida. The state of Florida said this is what you're gonna get, so I haven't played with those numbers at all. Expenditures are the work in progress. I meet with the directors or the principals or
Remember
whomever.
that part you said about K-12, those are technically our students, but not our
Our money.
company.
Right,
So that comes in as revenue, but bleeds.
right,
So
right.
if they
Okay.
changed that,
So it
it would
changes
change the
this.
bottom line too.
Yeah.
So basically though, a lot of these numbers are kind of way, just a wild shot in the dark.
Well, you mean the revenues?
Well, all these, for what you showed us here, where we're survivable here, and then the next year is
Well,
not
but no, they're really not.
survivable.
Well, to the extent that we have no idea what the revenues really are going to be. Right now, I'm using the
Correct.
March 15th. I think I said that, March 15th.
That's what I'm saying, that's why I think it's, we're kind
That's
of
the
a wild
second
shot in the
presentation.
dark.
That's the second
It
presentation.
is, and that's why I started saying, prepare for the worst. If this was a regular year, you would be hearing me say, we can get through this year this way.
Right.
But we know this is not gonna be a regular year, and we're not gonna know about this till we're well into the next fiscal year in November. So yes, in a way, it's a shot in the dark, but right now, these numbers reflect what the state is saying you're gonna get. So that's what we have to work with.
Right, I have to
Without
plan off
knowing what we're
something.
gonna end up in November with, or what, well, I'm out November 16th, so it's gonna be your bailiwick, and that's why I've been saying, let's prepare for the worst. We've already put the teachers and everybody on notice, don't expect any kind of increase right now, okay? And you sent a strong signal last meeting with the non-reappointments, and, we'll work through that. So, I mean, you are doing the right things to prepare. If this was a normal year, I would be saying, look, we can make this work.
Right.
But you know something's gonna happen. You don't know if it'll happen this year, or some of my folks in Tallahassee through FADS are saying it's gonna be hitting you next year.
The
Right.
21-22 year.
Right,
Yeah.
21, 22.
Right, and
So
that's what I've heard as well.
That's
Right.
really gonna be a shot in the dark, because you don't know what the future holds. I mean, your crystal ball is no better than ours.
Right, what we have
Absolutely
heard
not.
is that for next year, for the 2021 year, is that either the federal government or the state government will use reserves to make up some of those losses. So we're not in a serious cutting mode. Because when we get into the part